Okay, Alexander, we really need to talk about what's going on with CIA Director Burns and his trip to Russia, to Moscow, and the news that he actually not only met with his counterpart and other Kremlin officials, but he actually had a telephone call with Putin. And the timing of this is strange because we had a couple of articles, I think actually mainly from Politico, where they were trying to stoke up more Russia's going to invade Ukraine type of fears. And even Zelensky came out yesterday, and I think his spokesperson actually came out yesterday in Ukraine and said, we don't have any type of intelligence that Russia is going to be invading Ukraine or amassing troops near Ukraine's border. That's what the spokesman said. But anyway, the timing is kind of odd. I don't know. It seems to me like there's warships as well building up in the area. Something's at play here. I'm trying to figure out, is Burns there to give a warning to the Kremlin? Are these just war games? Is this propaganda? Are there neocons trying to create some sort of false flag? What do you think's going on?
Well, can I just first of all say this whole setup is totally and completely bizarre. Now, it's not unusual for the CIA director to want to establish contacts with his opposite numbers in Russia. I mean, if you remember, shortly after Mike Pompeo became director of the CIA, he actually hosted a meeting with some Russian intelligence chiefs in the US, even though those people were sanctioned. And, this is not unusual. But it's quite clear that Burns' visit wasn't like that. This was actual diplomacy. He went there not in order to establish intelligence cooperation or to discuss intelligence contacts with Russian officials who are involved in intelligence work. He was there on a political mission. Now, that in itself is weird. Why send the director of the CIA on a political mission? As it happens, Burns does have a background in diplomacy. He was US ambassador to Moscow in Obama's time. But he is the director of the CIA. The kind of people you send to do diplomacy for you is not the director of the CIA. It's the Secretary of State and his officials. It's the head of the National Security Council, the National Security Advisor. It's sometimes the vice president. Sometimes, if you're talking about military affairs, you send military people, like, the defense secretary or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Why, of all people, send the director of the CIA to Moscow? And why does the president of the United States needs to send an envoy in this kind of fashion at all to talk to the Russian leadership? If he wants to talk to Putin about something, why doesn't he just pick up the phone and speak to him? Well, I've done some programs about this, which you can find on my channel and also on Locals. But I'm going to make a guess. It seems to me that you are absolutely right. This does revolve around the situation in Ukraine and in the Black Sea region. And it's clear the whole thing there is now in a very dangerous point. We have Nord Stream 2 just about finished. Ukraine is running out of gas. It's running out of coal. Ukrainian business leaders are saying we've got to negotiate with Russia. Yulia Tymoshenko, you remember her, the Ukrainian politician? She's coming out and saying, we've got to negotiate with Russia.
She's just real quick. If people don't know her, I'll put a photo on her for the video. She's the one that had that kind of the hair and the braids.
That's right.
Sorry, I just want to kind of put a picture on her.
I mean, she's a perennial figure in Ukrainian politics, wants to be Ukraine's president, had a sort of ambiguous relationship with the people who were involved in the Maidan events in 2014. She's to some extent been frozen out. Everybody does accept, though, that, insofar as anybody in Ukrainian politics has brains, she probably has them. Nobody else seems
the gas princess, I think.
The gas princess. Yeah. I mean, I should say utterly corrupt. That's not just my opinion. Somebody who has undoubtedly done some pretty ruthless and terrible things, but at least he's got, two brain cells to rub together. Anyway, she's now coming out and saying, we've got to talk to the Russians. We've got to forge a deal with them. This situation can't continue. we can't afford to pay European prices for our gas. And beyond that, and this is the implication, in a 2 years' time, a year's time, we're no longer going to be a transit state anyway, so we can't just go on siphoning off the Russian gas that passes through our pipelines, because that's going to end. It's all going to go via Nord Stream and Turk Stream, and it's not going to pass through our pipelines. So that's what she's saying. And at the same time, there's all that's happening, the situation in Ukraine's deteriorating. You see a whole load of hardliners have been appointed to top positions in the Ukrainian military. There's been growing talk in Ukraine about, another push to bring in the Donbass and to roll up the Donbass situation. And we see US warships floating around the Black Sea, and some very powerful warships indeed. The flagship of the US Sixth Fleet, that's the major fleet that the United States keeps in the Mediterranean, which is a major command and control ship. The Russians have pointed out it was the ship that controlled the operation that overthrew Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya in 2011. So it's powerful military control ship, and it's accompanied by a guided missile destroyer, and they're both in the Black Sea at the moment. So a very, very tense situation on almost every conceivable front. And what seems to have happened is that Burns was sent to Moscow by the president to try to diffuse tensions. This is what we learn in CNN, an incredibly garbled report on CNN. We can't fully trust CNN, as we know, but it seems he was sent to Moscow to try to talk to the Russians. And from what I can piece together, he wasn't warning the Russians. He was telling them, look, for heaven's sake, we're not really supporting a war in Ukraine. We don't want to see a war. We don't want to see a war in the Black Sea. We don't want to see a war in Ukraine. We know that Ukraine will be utterly defeated if it goes to war. We're going to try and diffuse the situation. So please don't overreact. And why is Burns sent to Moscow? Because the president of the United States is in such a weak position within the administration that if he picks up the telephone and speaks to Putin, as he could easily do, as he did in April, he knows that there's all the Alexander Vindmans and people like that listening in on his call, and he doesn't trust them. He doesn't trust his Secretary of State, who is a neocon. He doesn't trust his Deputy Secretary of State, who is Victoria Nuland, who's also a neocon. He doesn't trust the leadership of the Department of Defense because, well, frankly, they're neocons also. So in order to conduct diplomacy, he has to do it in this completely unorthodox way, sending the CIA director to Moscow in order to try to get some kind of word through to Putin that, we're interested in calming the situation down. Now, I've done a big video in which you can see on Locals and on my channel, but especially on Locals, in which I unpack all of this. But if you take a step back and think about it, how terrible is that? That the President of the United States is in so little control that he has to resort to secret envoys in this kind of manner in order to avoid a crisis in Ukraine, which he clearly doesn't want at this time.
Well, this raises a lot of questions from my end, actually. Where should I begin here? First of all, it makes me very nervous when I see CIA directors heading towards that area. It reminds me of the Maidan, and I think it was Brennan, actually, at the time. Was it not Brennan that was making the trips pre-Maidan, pre-coup, kind of preparing the way? And a lot of people don't know that, or they don't report on that. It was Brennan, wasn't it?
Absolutely it was. Yeah, okay. Absolutely was.
Okay, so he was making many trips to Ukraine, and he was preparing the revolution, quote unquote, the revolution to take place. So it makes me very nervous when I see CIA directors conducting quote unquote diplomacy. But Burns obviously knows Russia, knows Moscow, and he has contacts there, as he was he was ambassador there for a certain amount of time. So he knows the lay of the land. so to speak. So, okay, it makes sense for him to go there and conduct some sort of diplomacy. But my first question, though, is, okay, let's start with the obvious. Do you actually believe that Biden is capable of formulating this type of strategy? Joe Biden? Or is this an Obama initiative in order to counter the other side of the White House power structure, which is the neocons trying to start up a war? I mean, what's going on here? Because, I mean, you say Joe Biden, the president, but I'm thinking, really, is Biden really that capable of understanding these dynamics and moving around these chess pieces to say, Burns, go there in order to diffuse the situation?
No, he's clearly not. I mean, that's absolutely obvious. I mean, we saw the president. I use the president because, you know, what we have to at least observe the fiction.
Then who is it?
I think it is his team. There are some people who are close to him, and I'm going to make a pretty shrewd guess, Obama as well. You mentioned that Burns was in Moscow. Burns was Obama's ambassador in Moscow. So I think Obama, who, again, you know, I'm not giving the man credit here. I mean, in fact, on the contrary, this indicts him. But he's actually said that in Ukraine, Russia has escalatory dominance. He actually said that in a big article, in a big interview he gave with The Atlantic. So he understands better than almost anyone else the fact that if there is a war in Ukraine, it's going to be an absolute debacle. So you can just see how it's worked out. He's done in the phones. He's talked to Burns, who is his friend. He's probably talked to Biden, or at least to people close to Biden. And that's why we see this visit by Burns to Moscow to try and calm the situation down. Now, the other thing, your comparison with Brennan is actually extremely important and very interesting because Brennan was allowed to roam. He went to Ukraine many times. You say, the Ukrainians had no control over what he was doing. The Russians have controlled every step that Burns has taken. They're extremely angry, by the way, and we'll come to that in a moment. They're very angry by this whole setup. And we'll talk about that. But they made sure that he only met with certain officials who are officials within the Kremlin. And he also, of course, was allowed to speak to Putin himself. Now, we know how utterly, now, you know, you come from a diplomatic family. You know how utterly bizarre it is when, of all people, it is the CIA director that talks to the head of state and conducts diplomacy. I mean, that's the job of the president himself, or of his secretary of state, or conceivably of his national security advisor. It's not the job of the director of the CIA to act as the president's chief envoy. And the Russians are absolutely livid. First of all, I am sure this trip was intended to be secret. But the Russians have leaked it to the media. They published photos of it. They published this extraordinary readout in the first meeting, which he had with Putin's top foreign policy advisor, Nikolai Patrushev, they issued the shortest readout I've ever seen, which is US-Russian relations were discussed. Full stop. That's all. Now, that is terse to the point of being insulting. And then, on top of that, they've now leaked the further news that he actually spoke on the phone to Putin himself, presumably doing it from Russia. Now, in other words, he wasn't able to meet with Putin. Remember, this is the president's envoy. He had to speak to Putin on the phone. I mean, already that looks bad. Now, there might be reasons for this. It may be that Putin isn't in Moscow, for example. But, you know, you could have set up the meeting, and clearly it didn't happen. And there's no readout of this call between Putin and Burns. The Kremlin hasn't published one. So, you know, we have Russian officials telling us about some of the things that are discussed, and we hear it's about regional conflicts, which looks like code for Ukraine. But all the indications are that the Russians are very angry. They feel they're being gamed. They're asking who is in charge. Why is Burns coming and speaking to us instead of the President or the Secretary of State or someone like that? And they're making it very clear that they're not happy and that they don't like engaging in secret diplomacy in this fashion.
Okay, so great. We're getting somewhere now. A lot of this is making sense listening to you and putting the pieces together. And to answer your question, the Russians feel gamed. Who's in charge? Well, if anyone in the Kremlin is watching, it's obviously Obama. Obama is the guy, and I think the dots connect very well, very logical. Burns served under Obama. Obama sends Burns to defuse the situation. I think it plays perfectly to the way Obama operated as well in his foreign policy approach, in that Obama never really liked direct confrontation, i.e. direct wars with other countries, especially Russia. He tried to shy away from it. But Obama very much was in favor of shadowy type of things, the clandestine kind of regime changes and color revolutions. As we saw in Ukraine, he didn't want to take on Russia directly, or in Syria, he didn't want to take on Russia directly, so he preferred proxy wars. He preferred color revolutions and what was Samantha Power's humanitarian interventionism. Yeah, right. So this kind of fits to Obama's foreign policy outlook. All of this, which would make me worried if I was the Kremlin. I would say, okay, so Obama sends his guy to us to defuse the situation, but if he's doing that to avoid direct conflict, we need to be very careful that Obama's not working some sort of, shadowy regime change plot in the background, because that's Obama's style. But my next question comes, if the Obama side of the White House power structure is sending Burns over to defuse a direct war or a Russia conflict with Ukraine, who is the side of the White House that is trying to escalate this, i.e. the warships, i.e. the Politico article, all of this stuff? Who's that? Is that Lloyd Austin? Is that the Clinton wing? Is that the Pentagon side of things? Who's trying to ramp stuff up?
Absolutely. Now, Kev, let's just talk about that Politico article, because there's no doubt there has been a gathering of Russian troops in a place called Yelnya. This is far from the Ukrainian border. And what happened after his various trips to Moscow is that we know that Burns also called Zelensky and appears to have told Zelensky, back off. At the moment, we don't want a war. And so we have what's clearly a pre-prepared propaganda offensive, which is circulating all over the American media, that there's another Russian buildup. We learn that there's been an enormous amount of outreach by the United States around European capitals, talking up the threat from Russia to Ukraine, all that nonsense. And at the same time, we see the Ukrainians contradicting it. I mean, that's so bizarre if you think about it. When have the Ukrainians ever downplayed a threat from Russia up to now? They're only doing it because they've been told to do it by someone important in Washington. They're told, if you don't do it, you don't pipe down now, then we're going to, you'll find yourself alone, because we're not going to support you. So that's why they've piped down. But it's clear that there was a media offensive prepared. There were these warships being sent to the Black Sea, and of course they're still there. And this is also all coordinated moves by someone. We'll get to who that someone is in a moment. And we also see somebody then rushes off. Well, almost certainly, I'm sure, Obama then rushes Burns off to Moscow in order to head this off, because they can see that there's a disaster coming. Now, who wants a war? Well, I'm going to make it straightforward. The neocons, obviously, always there. They always hanker for some kind of war. There's been talk in some articles that I've been reading in some of these weird think tanks that the way to detach Russia from China is by defeating the Russians in a war in Ukraine. So there's some talk of that, no doubt, going on. There's some people like this. But I think always now you have to look at this in terms of the conflict, the battle that's going on within the Democratic Party. It seems to me that there are hardline elements within the Democratic Party who want a war because they see that the situation in the United States is deteriorating, the president is losing support, and that at the same time the Clinton wing of the party feels to some extent as if it's been frozen out. And of course it's got the Durham situation to worry about, and it probably feels that it's coming under some kind of pressure. So what do? You start a war somewhere, you create a crisis somewhere. Remember Wag the Dog, that film? It all appeared at the time of the Clinton administration. Not a coincidence. And this looks to me like something of a Wag the Dog scenario that somebody was trying to pull off. And if I have to say where it traces back to, I'd say it's the Clinton side of the Democratic Party. That seems to me the logical one. So Obama heads it off. The Clintons, maybe not Bill and Hillary, but, the whole grouping of neocons and people like that around them were pushing for it. The Department of Defense is run by people like that. The Department of State is run by people like that. So you have to bring in the national security, the head of the CIA to sort of stop this, rush to war. The Clinton side is running with this thing, and the whole situation is unbelievably bad. And the Russians entirely validly say, who's in charge? And yes, Mr. Burns, you come along, you tell us all of these things, but given that you're coming to us in secret, you don't want to be caught on the phone, you don't want to talk to us from Langley, because obviously you're worried about who might be listening in. Your president doesn't want to talk to us on the phone from the White House because he's worried about who might be listening in. Given all that, how can we place any confidence or trust in anything that you are telling us? You say you don't want a war. You say your president doesn't want a war. But we can't assume that what you tell us carries any weight, because it's quite clear that you do not speak for a united government.
Right. I think the real war that we're seeing play out right now is the Obama faction versus the Clinton faction.
Yeah.
And yeah, I agree. The Clinton faction is definitely entrenched, definitely in the Pentagon. I believe that the Pentagon, Austin, and all of them, they're definitely on the neocon Clinton side of things. And the State Department, obviously you have people like Newland who are entrenched in the State Department.
Exactly.
And Blinken is such a weak character that I doubt he has much sway as to what's going on in the Department of State. So you have neocons there. So, the real conflict is really, Russia's kind of caught in the middle of this Obama v. Clinton factions, vying for power. And you have this weak, deteriorating figure in the Oval Office called Biden, and this is all about who's going to control the White House in the next 3 years, and they're probably thinking 3 and then 8 years out. That's probably what's going on in their minds right now. But that's the battle taking place, and
yes.
the neocons believe that a war with Russia would solve all the problems that they're having right now at home, and Obama's taken a very different approach. He doesn't want the direct conflict. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, but you're absolutely right, because that was Obama's style. I can remember we covered it on the Duran. We were almost the only people at the time who did. Subsequently, articles appeared, which have since vanished into the memory hole, which confirmed our reporting at the time. But back in October 2016, there was a crisis in Syria when it looked as if the US was prepared to launch major missile strikes on Syria on a much bigger scale than anything we've seen before to try to stop the fighting in Aleppo. We remember the Syrian army had an offensive. And the Russians said that if that happened, they'd shoot down the American missiles. And there was a moment when the Russian and American militaries looked like they might be, facing off against each other. And Obama, who, as I said, whatever else he is, he has enough understanding of the situation to know what a total disaster that would be, intervened and called all the whole thing off. He called off the missile strikes, and as a result, that situation was diffused. And that was just before the November election in 2016. And I've always myself felt that part of the anger towards Russia was from the thwarted neocons within the administration, the Obama administration, who were very, very angry about that. And as a result, that was one of the contributory factors behind Russiagate. But anyway, put all that history to one side. It is Obama's style. As you rightly say, he likes to do things behind the scenes. He likes to pull the strings, set the people running, have other people take the lead. He did that with Libya also, by the way. I mean, he gave the impression at the time in 2011 that he was this reluctant warrior who was reluctantly pulled into this war. And we now have learned, again, it's not widely known, that far from being reluctant, he was the person who was writing out all the Security Council resolutions that actually we then used by the United States to get the war going. So he doesn't like direct confrontations because he's worried that if they happen, the situation can spiral out of control and won't turn out well for the United States. And ultimately, of course, for himself. But others within the administration, the Democratic Party, they always hanker for confrontation because they always overestimate the strength of the United States in any given situation. This has been the story of the neocons throughout. They overestimated the ability of the United States to control the situation in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, wherever. And now they're making the same mistake with Ukraine.
Right. I think my question to you was, I completely agree. As we were saying in the previous segment as well, that Obama's style is definitely not direct conflict. We know that. He likes to work behind the scenes in the shadows. The way we saw the warships heading towards Russia, the way we saw, the articles about how the Russian troops are closing in on Ukraine, it's definitely the Clinton style in that when there's problems at home, whether it's Bill getting a BJ in the Oval Office or anything or any other domestic problems, what do? We start a war. During the Clinton administration, it was, well, we've got domestic issues here and very personal issues in the White House. So what do? Let's bomb Serbia for 72 days and nights. So definitely you could see, both factions have left their fingerprints at the scene of the crime, right? You see the Obama faction and how they're operating with Burns. We see the Clinton faction, which is saying, okay, send warships. But my question to you is, what does this say about how the battling factions, battling it out for control of the White House, where you have a huge power vacuum, what does this tell you about their approach to handling all the domestic issues in the United States? The Obama faction saying direct war, no, let's do some proxy stuff maybe, let's do some regime changes, fine, but no direct conflict, where the Clinton faction is saying, we need to distract, we need to get a war going, we need to bomb places and people and things, and that's how we're going to fix the domestic issues in the United States. And the problems in the United States are tremendous. We'll do a video on the infrastructure bill, which will come out in a day or two. But what does this tell you about how the battling factions are trying to deal with the terrible state of things at home? Well, something's there. Something's telling us, that this is. I don't know what. It's just interesting how we're seeing these two factions in the White House figure things out.
It tells us an awful lot, because what it tells us, for one thing, is that neither faction at the moment is able to prevail over the other. I mean, they always move, but neither side is able ultimately to gain complete control over the other and set a direction either for foreign or domestic policy. So we see a administration that is essentially jammed. It's blocked. It can't, as I said, follow a constructive policy. It tilts one way, it tilts the other way. So the result is that you always follow then the lowest common denominator. What you do, you spend money, because that's the way you paper over the cracks. We're going to come to that in that program. We will be discussing that in more detail in the program that we're going to discuss, the infrastructure bill. But that's the only thing they can agree upon at the moment. They can agree upon spending more, because that way both sides can get some of what they want. So the Clintons and the Obamaites are each able to get some slice of the cake, because and increase the slice of the cake, because they can't control it all. But if you look for coherence in policy, you're not getting it, because at the moment this administration is so divided that it can't come together on a single set of policies, whether on domestic policy or on foreign policy or on anything else.
I wonder who wins ultimately in the end.
Well, I'm going to make a guess. I suspect if this thing plays out long enough, it'll be the Obama faction. And I'll tell you why. First of all, I think Obama is a wilier person than the Clintons are. And I think that he's probably got control of more levers than the Clintonites do. I also suspect that because he's so clever at covering his tracks, there's an awful lot more you can find on the Clintons than there is on him. So I suspect it will be the Clintons. But it's not impossible that they could each bring the other down. In other words, we could see the whole thing implode. They fight it out until the whole thing comes crashing down. That's not impossible. But anyway, the important thing to say is that as a result of this policy paralysis in Washington, the United States is in a crisis and the president is not in control. And a crisis not just with, Iraq or Libya or wherever, but with another nuclear superpower, with Russia, and with the Russians, as I said. They've been made very, very angry by this trip by Burns. If you follow Russian commentary closely and you see how they're bit by bit dripping out information about this visit, which is clearly intended to be secret, you can tell that they're very, very angry about it, that they don't like being gamed in this way. They've worked out for themselves that the situation in Washington is completely dysfunctional and that they can't trust anybody there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, there's no doubt that there's this massive power vacuum in the United States right now. In Washington, D.C., there's no doubt that Biden isn't running anything. He's making zero decisions. And there's no doubt that there are these factions battling it out in the White House. What if Obama did not send Burns? And what if the Clinton faction got their way? I mean, that's the danger of it, isn't it? Yeah. What if the Clinton faction manages to sneak an attack, today it's Russia, tomorrow it's Taiwan, the next day it's Iraq or Syria or anywhere. What if the Clinton faction manages to actually get the war that they're looking for? That's the worry.
It's a debacle. It'll be an utter and complete debacle. And unfortunately, the problem is, wars against, Libya, Syria, Iraq, whatever, Yugoslavia. I mean, those are bad enough in themselves, and they always end badly in the end. But of course, war against China and Russia is an entirely different thing again. I mean, that's on a completely different level. And you're quite right. I mean, if they get this, because there's this agitation all the time for conflict, for some sort of use of force, this desire to use the American military, this belief the other side is bluffing, a mistake these people consistently make. They always think the other side is bluffing when it isn't. Anyway, there's always this restless urge to start something. And of course, if they start it with the Russians, and somebody seems to have been thinking of doing precisely that, well, I mean, frankly, the consequences are just beyond description, beyond imagination. There was a very recent article. Unfortunately, it's not been made public because It's from a Pittsburgh professor, Professor Brennan, who does international relations. He circulates it amongst people who are on his mailing list. But it's a big analysis and it's been much talked about. I'm not giving anything away now. It's already been mentioned in public. But he says that the only way sanity can be restored in Washington is by an event comparable to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now think about that. We have to get into that kind of situation before we start to see sanity prevail in Washington. I'm actually far from confident that's the case, that even if we had a Cuban Missile Crisis, that kind of sanity that Professor Brennan talks about, no relation, by the way, to the other Brennan, would prevail. And can I also say that, of course, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had the president was John F. Kennedy, JFK. This time, it's not JFK, it's Joe Biden. Well, as somebody once famously said, I remember JFK, he was my friend. Mr. Biden, you're not JFK.
Yeah. Well, that actually leads to my final question, which is if the Clinton faction probably game planned everything out, and they probably said the only way to get out of this mess that we've gotten into, this Biden, Kamala, inflation, supply shortages, just everything, a complete mess. The only way out is a war. Is that how they game planned it out? And is there any truth to that?
Well, I think, first of all, it's not true. It's completely wrong. And especially goading a conflict with Russia would be just, as I said, absurd. I mean, let's assume, let's just take the best case scenario, assuming there ever is a best case scenario, and assume that there is a war in Ukraine and it gets limited to Ukraine. Everybody accepts Ukraine would lose. Even, I suspect, the Clintonites accept they would lose. So all these warships that are floating around, it's difficult to imagine that they would actually directly get involved. But then there's, the president comes on television, talk of crisis, but of course he's humiliated because Ukraine loses. Secondly, he has to impose sanctions. He has to disconnect Russia from SWIFT. Russians can deal with that. What else does he do? Does he impose some kind of blockade on Russian energy exports? Now, we are looking at $100 a barrel oil within a few weeks. I mean, Bank of America is saying $120 a barrel oil by April. Think of what happens if the United States and its strong arms its allies to block Russian energy exports. We're not talking about $120 a barrel oil. We're talking about $400 a barrel oil, perhaps $1,000 a barrel oil. What happens to all the gas exports? It can't flow through Ukraine. That's a war zone. Nord Stream 2, is it opened in that situation? Does Europe import gas? Think of the situation, the crisis situation in Europe. And of course, if the situation escalates, and even if it stops short of nuclear war, will international shipping continue in a clash between the superpowers? What will the Chinese do? I mean, the whole thing is it just doesn't bear thinking about. I mean, you would not solve your problems. You'd make them 100 times worse.
Yeah, but in their mind,
multiply them. But in their mind, it might do. Because the other thing they would do, and this is perhaps the most sinister aspect of this, is that they would clamp down. they would knock out everybody who is there talking realism, because of course they're not realists. They're agents of Moscow and the Kremlin and that kind of thing. So, I mean, in a way, it would massively exacerbate the problems. On another hand, it would, as I said, create an opening for absolute control. And of course, nobody at that point would be very interested in Russiagate or investigating Russiagate, because let's face it, if we're in a confrontation with Russia, nobody will want to look into those issues. So, you can see a kind of twisted logic to it, but at this, a logic which some people might find attractive. I'm going to just finish this segment by making the point again that that article in Politico, that article in the Washington Post about the Russian troop movements was clearly pre-planned and pre-prepared. The Ukrainians were certainly in on the game, and it's also coordinated with this movement of the ships into the Black Sea. So, this is a media campaign with somebody, it must have been Obama, because who else could it have been, realistically, has switched off. And that was why Burns was sent to Moscow.
This worries me so much. We'll end it here, Alexander, but I mean, it worries me because you said twisted. That is their logic, though. Their logic is twisted, and they're saying, I'm convinced that they're sitting around at some desk, and they're saying the only way out of all of this mess that we have, Durham as well, all of this, is the conflict with, right now it's Russia, a conflict with Russia. That's our way out. I can see like the Robbie Mooks and the Podestas all sitting there and saying, our only way out is conflict. We have to go this route. And that is their twisted logic. And what worries me is that something's going to get through. Maybe this time Obama cut them off with Burns, but maybe next time, the Obama faction of the White House may not be able to cut them off. I don't know.
Absolutely. Remember also, the one thing these people are very good at is bureaucratic battles. If the only person who can be trusted to carry out these secret missions is Burns, and that's an extraordinary thing in itself, then Burns is going to be in their sights. Keep an eye out and see if he remains CIA director for much longer.
Yeah, and let's not forget that when we're talking about neocons and the Clinton machine, it's not only Democrats. You got to look at the Republican side and the rhinos,
Correct.
And the Lindsey Grahams and the Mitch
Correct.
McConnells and all these people
Correct.
who are also, I would say, they're more aligned with the neocon Clinton machine than with the Obama,
Absolutely.
Susan Rice machine.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I absolutely 100% agree with that. They were never happy with Obama. They always disliked and distrusted him for all kinds of reasons. But they were got on perfectly well with Clinton, as I very well remember, even when they were trying to impeach him.
Wow, what a development. Very dangerous.
Absolutely.
Very dangerous
I think this is one of the most extraordinary incidents that's happened. As I said, it's been very difficult to piece together what's happening, but gradually the pieces are starting to fall into place. I'm talking about Burns' visit to Moscow.
I think it's made it very clear as well what's happening inside the United States and in the White House.
Absolutely.
This incident
Absolutely
has clarified the situation and the power vacuum. We've been saying it for a while. I mean, you've said this is a big power vacuum, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing groups fighting to get control of the United States and to get control of this power vacuum.
Absolutely.
It's very dangerous.
It is an extremely dangerous situation.
Yeah. All right, we'll leave it there, the Duran.locals.com, and go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code Real News. Here you see my Greek magic mug. And Alexander has his magic mug as well. And also go to Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, and Super U to see all our videos there. Take care.